All right, so you did your little introduction there. That's great. So, just so everyone is kind of on the same page, this is Jonathan Rogers. He's one of the directors for PoE2, and you've been quite busy doing a round of interviews with many people at many events, spreading the word about the features in the upcoming game that many of us are dying to try. So
Well, hopefully.
we did an interview at ExileCon. There's been a few announcements since, but I've noticed that you've actually been really active on the Path of Exile 2 subreddit, answering questions of just about anyone that has one for you. It's been kind of
hmm
difficult for me to kind of compile all that information, so maybe I'm going to ask a question that has been asked already. My goal is to ask new questions. It's just a very, very difficult task because the information isn't really like there's a wiki, but even the wiki has some info wrong. Like I actually had a question about the crafting bench being removed,
Yeah, yeah.
but apparently you've actually addressed that recently on
hmm
Reddit. So again, and of course with all of this information, with the game still being in development, I hope people understand that you'll just be giving your best answer from what you can share with us, and nothing
Sure.
is final and all that for the disclaimers. Okay, great. So I wanted to start with a round of the questions that I kind of put together. And
hmm
then I have a number of questions that I saw unanswered on Reddit, on actually just a few YouTube videos. I pulled some questions from chat, and we will pull further questions from chat as we go throughout the segment. But yeah, so it should be a pretty good segment. So first, I kind of wanted to dive and talk a little bit about the last trailer that you had, which was the Mercenary
hmm
trailer. In that, you announced that you have WASD movement. And
hmm
I tried to kind of imagine this, like, how I would play with it. It feels like I would, a lot of the time, not want to go exactly right or exactly left or exactly up or exactly down. And with the keyboard, it's maybe a little bit difficult to actually combine that. Now, I know some people really wanted this feature, so you're bringing it to them. But I have to imagine, is this more tailored for like a controller style gameplay?
So that wasn't our initial thinking. I honestly, it was just when I was, trying out the mercenary. So this had been suggested in our studio a long time ago. To be clear, right? Like, there's people have been saying, "Hey, maybe we should do this for a while," and I was kind of always on the idea that this is something we should try, but it never was kind of like the right moment to do it because it is quite a complicated thing to actually fully pull off. Um, and then when we were doing mercenary stuff, I was kind of like, okay, we have some of the preconditions we needed to actually to go and try it. The other thing as well, of course, is yeah, like people in the community have been keen for ages. So then I was just like, you know what, let's give it a shot. And I wouldn't say that controller was really the first thing on my mind. It was, but I mean, obviously the improvements we make, I'm sure, will benefit controller. But it really was just like making how can I make this class feel good, and kind of generally my feeling is that whatever it takes to make the combat feel good is what we will try. Yeah, it's kind of just one of those things that happen that way. I don't think that the limitation of having only 8 directions with WASD is particularly a problem in practice.
Hmm.
It seems to kind of just be fine, just from me playing anyway. Yeah, like that hasn't really been an issue, and because the character always sort of looks towards where your mouse is. It doesn't honestly even really feel like 8 directional movement because the character can technically kind of walk in any direction relative to where they're facing. So you end up kind of just completely forgetting the fact that it's actually 8 directional, and yeah, just kind of works.
Well, since you have tried it, and I guess you're probably one of the only ones who has tried it, are you a convert? Are you going to be a WASD enjoyer moving forward in PoE2?
I'm pretty sure I am. Yes, I was actually very skeptical outside of range. Like my first, when we were talking about it, I was like, okay, this is going to be a thing for range. I don't think melee is going to be that great. And actually, the reason why I thought that is there was this game. No, what was it called? I don't think it ever actually released. It was in beta. It might have been called like Pagan Online or something like that
Hmm.
from ages ago, and they had WASD movement in an action RPG, and I really hated it. I thought that the movement felt really terrible, the combat felt terrible, and so I was kind of imagining that we would have the same problem with our melee. But then what I found was when I actually tried that out, is that it actually felt really good, and I think the reason is because of the step attack stuff we have. What that means basically is that when you attack, we have different animations depending on whether you're moving at the time, and also depending on whether there's a monster that's like where the monster is relative to you. So we've got animations of the character sort of stepping forward, and the key thing we're trying to do there is to make it so that you never lose momentum on your character. So it feels really bad if your character just kind of comes to a stop and then attacks.
Yeah.
And so by adding these extra animations, it allows us to make the character feel like they're kind of flowing forward and then going into the attack. So because we have those, I think it actually drastically improves how melee combat feels with WASD, and I actually am a fan of it. I think it feels pretty damn good.
Well, I guess I'll have to give it a try. I was skeptical as well, but on your recommendation, I guess more of us will perhaps be more open-minded on it. Now, since you mentioned there's like a more of an active flow of combat, the Mercenary also has, in addition to the instant attacks, something that kind of caught my eye was the attacks while moving.
Correct.
Now, the closest thing we have to this is some form of cyclone or cyclone triggering other skills in Path of Exile 1. And with cyclone actually being a pretty poor skill otherwise, it still has this mainstay in the game just because it can be used while moving. Is this going to be like a full attack while moving, or is it like cyclone-ish where you have certain movement penalties? Like, is there something you can elaborate on that? And maybe if this is something more than just what the Mercenary will have?
Yeah, so on rapid shot in particular, basically you just get a 50% move penalty while you're doing it. So just whatever your movement speed is, it'll be halved during rapid shot, and that sort of tends to feel pretty reasonable. This is something that I'm keen to do more of with other skills in the game. I think it actually makes the pace of combat feel faster when you can sort of begin attacking before you arrive at your next pack. Or just sort of otherwise having something to do while you're retreating. So I kind of quite like the feel of that, and so I'd like to do some of that as well. But I don't want to make it to the point where every skill you can just do while moving, because I think that results in very floaty combat that I don't really like. So in particular for melee, you kind of have to make sure you're splitting the difference a little bit of where you need to make sure, like what I think can be good is that you can kind of ease it into, like you start an attack, and during the start of that attack, you've kind of got movement that can be controlled, and then there's kind of a part where the movement control you have tones down to potentially zero for at least a little while, and then back into having movement again towards the end, and that kind of thing can kind of allow you to have like the feeling of you're still able to do a lot of control even in melee. But also I think for other ranged classes as well, it can be good to have just a few options. Not necessarily a lot of options, but at least a few options that allow you to be done while moving. There's just certain things I think that can feel really good from that. And so we have been experimenting with other classes and other skills as well. Like we think there are certain skills that can really benefit from that kind of thing. Yeah, it's definitely something I want to do more of.
So I kind of wanted to ask this later, but I'll jump to it now since you've touched upon it. One thing that I feel isn't super cut and dry in the presentations for the classes is what is attributed to the class and what is attributed to the skill. Because people, when they're seeing Path of Exile 2, they often forget that I hope it's still true anyway, that skill gems are just skill gems and can be used by any class. So the idea of attacking while moving when watching like the Mercenary trailer, I guess the viewer doesn't know for sure if it's something that the Mercenary gets or if it's something that's attributed to the skill.
Right. So the only thing that the classes actually technically get is the Ascendancy Classes that belong specifically to them, plus the starting position in the tree, right? So, and that's still true in PoE2. It's just that whenever we're presenting like content, especially when we've got like an audience we expect to have a lot of new players in, we kind of tend to want to keep to the stereotypes and kind of not like go into that other side of things too much, because I think it just confuses the issues. And really, when you're presenting a class to someone, what you're kind of presenting them is some kind of vision for what type of a character they might want to be. And so that tends to be what we focus on. But of course, I mean, at the end of the day, like it is still very much my preference to have everything be as much as possible, like have interesting combos from other stuff. And we still have that very much like Magic the Gathering style idea of, hey, you can splash to another color. There's other, like use things off attribute, that kind of stuff. It's still very important to me. So yeah, like absolutely you can use all of those things are part of the skill and not part of the class.
Another aspect to this was to the Mercenary trailer that I was quite interested in. So again, we don't know how much of it has to do with the general gameplay, but in the Mercenary trailer, when I mean, people should watch it, but when the Mercenary takes on the boss at the end of the trailer, the pacing of the boss fight is, I believe, he's kind of trying to dodge attacks. He's like debuffing the boss, and then when the boss gets to about like 30, it just dies super quick. And I'm guessing it's because he's stacking up all these debuffs throughout the fight. Is this something more tailored towards the Mercenary, or is this kind of how you envision combat across the board?
So generally speaking, we like what I guess the feeling I like to try and get is that you've got some kind of way to do really large amounts of damage, but you can't always necessarily perfectly execute that because of what the boss is doing. So in that particular thing, it wasn't actually that there were debuffs on the boss. I just managed to execute a perfect. So the combo I was using there was you use Incendiary Rapid Shot, which builds up like heat on your crossbow. And then with that, when you fire a grenade, the grenades get extra fire damage on them based on how much heat there was on the crossbow. And then you can then use Incendiary Power Shot to detonate those grenades. So I just kind of managed to get all the grenades in the right place and get the like the maximum amount of heat on my crossbow at the time at that exact moment. And that's why I did like a really large amount of damage right at the end there. But in order to be able to get that, you need to be able to use Rapid Shot for enough time without having interruption to build up the heat and that kind of thing. So it's just a matter of kind of getting that sorted out. I think there also might have been something to do with the baby going on there. I can't remember the exact thing around that, but the bosses can go down very quickly if you know how to execute. And actually, an interesting thing with that is that the first time with the Mercenary setup that we had for that trailer that I played the boss, that I killed it. It actually took me 5 minutes. And I said to Mark, hey, man, what's up with this boss fight? Like, that's taking way too long. Like, what are we doing here? And he's like, what are you talking about? It takes me like 1 minute at most. Like, you must be terrible. And then I tried it again immediately. And then the next time I played it, it took me 2 minutes without like me really realizing that I had particularly learned anything. So it actually turns out that, it doesn't actually take long to learn the mechanics of the boss. And once you know them, the degree of increase in damage you can deal is so much higher. And that's because once you've learned the mechanics of the boss isn't disrupting you quite as much because you kind of know what to expect. And that allows you to kind of build up those various combos that let you execute large amounts of damage. So, that's kind of what happened there. And so now, of course, it's actually another case I had of that was the Blind Beast. I was doing this demo with the Druid and the Blind Beast just again and again and again and again. At the beginning, I was taking me 3, 4, 5 minutes to kill that boss fight. And then by the time that I actually recorded the one that I think went online, it was done in like freaking 30 seconds or something like that. And it's literally just from just playing the boss again and again. So, it is sort of impressive how learning the mechanics does actually make you better at the game.
As a follow-up question, since you mentioned that this idea of figuring out where the DPS windows are and being able to properly execute your combos, resulting in like multiples more damage, is that perhaps something that might be a bit difficult to tune with multiplayer? Like if you had like a 2-player party and you just had a really tanky friend keeping the boss perfectly still, wouldn't that in a sense make it much easier?
It can do, but there are various factors. So a lot of the crowd control type mechanics have things built. So for example, freeze, right? If you freeze a boss, then the next freeze takes longer. That's like a thing that kind of cools off over time. But effectively, like the more party members you have, there's kind of this like the various systems that work sort of like how poise works all respond to that. So that kind of means that someone sitting there stunning the monster is gonna, if you've got like multiple people doing that, it's going to get harder to sort of crowd control the boss over time. And then it should sort of come out to be relatively similar once you've reached the steady state, as it were, versus having a single player. Once you take into account the amount of increase in life and all that other sort of stuff. So we kind of have to get that tuned exactly right, which I can't say we've done a huge amount of tuning so far on, honestly, because we still need to do a bunch of work there. But ideally, the intention is kind of get it to the point where it sort of feels a little bit similar. But of course, there has to be room for synergy between between characters, right? And we definitely build that in as well. But it will. Ideally, you're not just going to completely trivialize the boss just because you've got a couple of extra players in your party. It's still intended. I mean, we've always striven for like it's just as good in single player as it is in multiplayer. Like making sure the balance of that is there.
All right. Now, this is kind of where I meant to ask the question, but I guess I'll elaborate. I was still really curious what pushes a skill and how much of a role the ascendancies have to do with it. Again, we've seen the druid interpreted in other games where it is very much the class. That is, like, in other games, there's no other shape-shifting class. If you want to play a shapeshifter, you play the druid. Now, in PoE2, I imagine the shape-shifting part is a skill gem that other classes can use. So what makes the druid more of a druid? How much does the ascendancy have to do with it? Is it kind of in a way where it's like PoE1, where they're just slightly better at it?
So when we're doing ascendancy classes as well, it's another one of those cases where we try to make it so that the ascendancy classes can be relevant for builds even when you wouldn't think so. So what we try to do is, like, you got an ascendancy class. If you look at it and what it's called and what it obviously looks like it should be doing, it is clearly going to be good at doing, what you expect the ascendancy class is going to be doing. But at the same time, we try to sort of word all the stats so that they don't technically require, that you're actually using shapeshift forms, for example. They just happen to be very good at the things that shapeshift forms happen to do, and you sort of look at it that way. But we do want to make it so that absolutely you should be able to play, a shape-shifting duelist or something like that. It can be something that we want to have scope for, even if it isn't necessarily common or the most obvious thing to do. It is something we've always, like to try and make it so you can do that. You know what I mean?
All right. So you guys put out the date for the PoE2 beta. I believe it's in early June, and this is going to be a pretty big milestone. I kind of wanted to ask a pretty broad and general question, and I have no idea what to expect for a reply because I'm sure there's still a lot of things in the work. But what can people expect out of this beta? Like, are we going to see the whole game up until the point where it's developed, or are we just going to have kind of like a shareware limited act version like we've seen from more recent titles?
So the plan is the whole game, but obviously, we're not necessarily going to have finished everything. I don't think that the entire end game will be there. Like, we're sort of planning probably around like 60 maps as like a sort of starting point for the end game. There will be a couple of other end-game systems in there as well, but I obviously don't really want to talk too much about them right now. We really do need to make sure that it's the whole campaign at the very least, and maps as well, just so that we can actually do progression testing. Because if we can't test the whole game, we're kind of not really learning anything on that economic front. And I think that is one of the more important things we can get out of the beta, and making sure that there's nothing too kind of like I don't know, like nothing that's like breaking the game too hard, because during beta, obviously once you're out of beta, right, like we can never remove items or really, like they have to exist forever at that point, right? So we want to make sure that everything's good there, but making sure that the progression is good and all that stuff really just requires the whole game to kind of be there. So yeah, it won't be like all content, but it will be like not especially not an end game, but it will be a very sizable amount of it. And there might be like a couple of classes that we can't initially do. I'm hoping we can do all of them, but we'll sort of see where we get to with that. But it should be most of them at the very least. And I honestly, like, I should hope that anyone who's in the beta would see it as a game that is like fully, like, has full quality and as big or bigger than any other kind of action RPG title that you would get.
Well, that's great. Going through the different places on the internet where people are talking about PoE2, the players that don't already play PoE1, their main concern has to do with Path of Exile in general as a genre being a bit complex. And with new game releases generally trying to at least touch upon broad appeal, is there some things that PoE2 is tackling differently than PoE1 to kind of grab the attention of some prospective players?
So I think that, like, this is kind of one of those really complicated ones, because it is very important to us that we never dumb the game down to the extent that, you won't be able to do all the interesting stuff that we're known for. But at the same time, we do obviously understand the fact that, we're known as a very complicated game. And I think it's sort of interesting because there are certain things about that. Like, so I've actually been talking a lot recently with people on the team about this and like what we can do to kind of improve things. And I think there's kind of a mix of factors. So on the one hand, you've got stuff that we've already kind of like announced how we're fixing it. Stuff like this, the way the skill system works, I think is just like way better for new players. This kind of thing is just straight up improvement. But I think that there are things like I mean, there was a recent conversation on Reddit as well about the skill tree and what we're doing about it. And I think a lot of people, I think there's a lot of subtlety with it because it's like a lot of people are like, oh, you should just have free respecs all the time so that it's just easy. And if you make a mistake, it's no problem. This kind of thing. And I kind of look at that and I'm like, I don't know that that's really necessarily going to solve the problem. I think like we've kind of got this issue of like trying to communicate information in a both succinct way so it doesn't kind of scare people off, but also enough information you actually sort of get everything. So I've been looking into ways recently about how we can kind of do that. And I think that I mean, this is like a feature that we've just been proposing recently, but kind of haven't actually gone any way towards implementing yet. But we're talking about like making it so that when you go to allocate stats on the passive tree, that it's more clear whether or not the skills that you have equipped would actually be affected by it. Like this kind of thing. Like we've been discussing sort of like, what are the common pitfalls that people are going to run into. But the other thing as well is that we're planning on just doing some straight up usability testing. We've got like, in the future, we've got a usability lab that we're going to be using to kind of like test with completely just like players that are off the street and just kind of see, like how they respond to things, like do they understand things. So, there's a lot we can do here, and it is going to be a focus, but at the same time, I just don't want people to hear from that the idea that, oh, we're just going to make the game, we're just going to dumb it down, you know what I mean? Like, it is really important that we not do that.
Well, that's good to hear. I was browsing the wiki, because there is a PoE2 wiki. It's kind of just a list of information, and I'm sure, again, some of it... not necessarily outdated as far as the public knows, but perhaps you'd like to touch upon the subject because we're bringing it up again. One thing that PoE has gotten some attention for is kind of like the instant logout that's especially used by hardcore players. On the wiki, I found that there is set to be a 2.5-second cast time for opening portals mid-combat, and taking damage will interrupt it.
It is actually just in boss fights. You can do it instantly when you're not in a boss fight. But yes, the idea is to actually prevent you from doing that, right? Like we want you to actually have to actually fight the boss and be able to kill it in one go, ideally. Or maybe that there's a few points of the boss fight where where you would be able to take the opportunity. But the key thing is there's still some skill there. It's not just it isn't just a matter of like go in, go out here, that kind of thing.
So you try to find the window where you can cast your portal to kind of reset your flasks and kind of maybe make a quick change. But if you, my understanding, and I think this was the case for the demo at ExileCon this year, if you die, the boss encounter does reset, right?
Correct.
Okay. And I've also learned, again, on the wiki, so again, I'm not sure if this is current, but apparently you can pause during solo play. Is that right?
You can. Yep, you can.
Do you see this as potentially being abused by hardcore players, pausing in a moment where they for sure will know they'll die and they'll just wait for like the next patch cycle or hotfix to like reset their character's position?
So you can always log out and reset the boss fight whenever you want, right? Like you're not going to... if you Alt F4, ultimately, that ends the boss fight, right? Because... because you can log back in and start from scratch. But the key thing you can't do is just whittle the boss down, like one, like log out, go back to town, heal, go back to the boss, and then continue from scratch. You know what I mean? So like it is actually, I mean, maybe okay isn't the word, but it is a thing you can do to Alt F4 from a boss fight to prevent your death. And I think that is something that there is really no solution for, if it even honestly needs solving. Like it's because now, but in PoE1. The cost wasn't high enough, right? Because like you just go back and continue the boss fight from where you left off. If you still have to be able to kill the boss in one go, if you know what I mean. In PoE2, which was not the case before. So and this actually, by the way, is something that we have to be really careful about, because it means that bosses that are progression blocking can be actually progression blocking, right? Like like if you can't kill it, you just can't continue the game in some cases, right? If it's an act boss or something like that. So there's people have to get good in some cases, but also we have to just be really careful that those progression blocking bosses don't, completely alienate people as well.
With that in mind, I'm actually something that came to mind is it going to be like a one campaign per character type of thing, or will you be able to like have multiple characters to kind of help with the bosses along to kind of alleviate the progression?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what you mean about that. But I mean, you will have to complete the campaign on each character,
Okay.
but you can always like, I mean, just like in PoE1, right? Like there's things you can do to rush another character through, like quickly if you're in a
Right.
party
No, I
like
was
that.
thinking like
Yeah.
if you had a character that really wasn't good at all against a certain boss, could you get your other character to kill it for
Oh,
that
I see
one?
what you mean. No, no, no. So yeah, it doesn't work like that. It basically works like PoE1 in this regard.
Okay.
Yeah. Although interestingly, well, no, actually, scratch that. I was about to say something. I realized we haven't announced it yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so I have maybe a difficult question for you, but
Mhm.
around the time we got Ruthless, we started hearing some of the news for PoE2, and a lot of it
Mhm.
kind of matched up. And we'll talk about the crafting bench and all that being removed, just
Right, right,
kind of
right.
similar features in a way. Ruthless in PoE1 has seen kind of like lukewarm popularity.
Sure.
Personally, I really like it. I think it's maybe a touch more ruthless than I would like, but I mean,
I
like
actually agree.
I'm
I
playing
actually agree.
non-ruthless this league, and
Right.
so far this league I've found about 30,000 alteration orbs to where I don't even bother
Yep.
using an
Yep.
augmentation orb
Yep.
because it takes too
Yep.
much
Yep.
time to click it back and
Yep.
forth,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So obviously the answer is somewhere in between the two.
I
But
agree.
how are you designing the kind of the pacing of the game and the abundance of currencies and items and all that? What
Hmm.
has the goal changed seeing Ruthless not like explode in popularity, I guess is my question.
So there's a lot to talk about here, like a lot. I guess the first thing with Ruthless is I think Ruthless did definitely go too far. And more to the point, I actually think Ruthless bundled in too many things in one go. I think if Ruthless had just been item drop changes and hadn't done a lot of other things that Ruthless did, like for example, crafting bench removal and the movement skill stuff and like a bunch of other that stuff, I think it actually would have gone down a lot better. And I also think as well that there probably wasn't enough attention paid to map sustain and a few other details like that. Like in particular, I think one of the major philosophical things we did learn from Ruthless is that we need to make sure not to reduce the access to content being a big thing. Like I think that Ruthless did make it too hard to get access to content, and also like probably the currency was a bit too rare. There's like various things about that that were just I think not quite right. Um, but also, and I'd love to fix those in Ruthless, honestly. But the problem with that is that whenever we say, "Hey, we're doing a bunch of Ruthless stuff to improve it," we just kind of get a lot of, "Why are you working on Ruthless?" You know what I mean? Like, so I don't think that like the ship has kind of sailed there, unfortunately, which is a bit of a shame. Which isn't to say we won't ever address it, but I think we at least learned a lot from Ruthless to help there. So I mean, I guess that's one side of things, but the next side of things, I guess, just comes into all of the general philosophy of how item drops should be should be done in PoE2. And I think everyone can agree that we definitely need to fix the fact that the amount of shit on the screen is so high that, I mean, like, okay, so random thing, Mark was decided that what he was going to do this league in PoE1 was play the like ultra ridiculous item finding strategies. He'd
Oh,
never actually done the like
it's a good
full on
choice.
crazy strategies before. And one of the things he ran into was the fact that when you get to a certain point, you can't even press Alt anymore because the game client will take so long to have all of the pop-ups appear on screen that you get disconnected from the server. um, so that's not so good. There's definitely some problems there. So yeah, that's obviously the other side of the extreme. But I guess I'm interested to actually hear your question about this because this was an interesting one. Is what do you think should be the difference in amount of value that, say, an average, like let's say 50th percentile player gets versus a 99th percentile player? Like, I'm interested to hear what kind of multiplier you believe is good.
Um,
Just like a
it's really
broad.
tough. I don't know. I quite like the ruthless economy. I quite like it
Mhm.
because everything has significance and everything has
Mhm.
significance.
For
Like
sure.
after playing ruthless quite a lot for like 2 3 weeks, I start to have an overabundance of transmutation orbs. Right?
Hmm.
So that's when they start losing their value.
Hmm.
I feel that's honestly a good point to be at.
Hmm.
When a currency that's fairly regularly dropping becomes worthless, being like 2 weeks for a hardcore player in. Just everything kind of
Right.
mattering is one of the really big appeals for Ruthless for me. I feel like the conversation of the average player versus, the top 1% player kind of gets lost in Trade League because people are really good at manipulating the economy, or people are really good to play in parties efficiently, where that model gets completely destroyed. So I really hesitate to give an answer in numbers there.
I think you still need to have a reasonably large disparity between average 50th percentile and 99th percentile, because that's kind of the thing that you're striving for a lot of the time, is increasing your drop rate. And so I actually think that one of the issues is, then the other question is, alongside this, to kind of, let's establish some constants here, right? So I would say, and this may seem like a high number, but I think that you need a difference of 1,000 times between the best player and the average player of amount of wealth acquisition. So that isn't to say number of items, I'm saying value of the stuff that you're getting. And that's so that you've got something to strive for, right? You need that level of of disparity from the bottom to the top. To kind of make it actually, to actually give some form of feeling of I'm getting better at this game, I'm improving, what I'm doing. So I don't know if does that number seem high or low to you? What do you reckon? How does that feel to you?
It's if you're considering the trading prowess of market geniuses, then it doesn't seem high. If we're talking about efficient play with stacking the right mechanics and multipliers, that does seem very high. So I just don't know what we're talking about exactly.
Sure. I think we're just talking about let's just say let's say from a map that you're running when you're, as I said, you're an average player running a map versus the absolute max mega juiced crazy map. You know what I mean? In terms of the amount of wealth coming from it. And so, as I said, that may seem high, but actually I think you do need those kinds of numbers to achieve that. And so then the next question is, okay, well, how many more items can you actually drop on the ground from one to the other to actually feel reasonable? And I think that number's kind of not really more than 2x. Maybe it's a little bit more than that, but the thing is, on the actual ground, you probably don't want to see more than double the number of items from one to the other, and yet you need to feel, and you need to actually be receiving 1,000 times the value. So if we kind of break that down, I mean, so there's a few things that go into this. So one question is, and this sort of matters, is that efficiency of your build comes into it, how fast can you do a map, because that does come into the kind of 1,000 number. So if for example the difference between an average player and a 1% player is 10x in speed of playing a map, so so if a bad player can do a map in 20 minutes and it takes a good player 2 minutes, for example, to do, then you've already kind of divided that by 10, which means that the actual items on the ground have to be 100 times more valuable per map. And I think that probably sounds like something that seems within the realm of reasonableness, I would hope.
I see.
Yep.
Okay.
But then the next thing as well is that if the amount of items on the actual ground per monster you kill is only 2x higher, then that means you've got you have to be able to have increase of rarity be worth 50 times, right? So basically you have to be able to increase the value of items on the ground by 50 times with just rarity bonuses alone, and it needs to feel 50 times more as well. It's not enough to just be in theory I kind of know that this is more valuable. It has to really feel like you're getting 50 times more wealth.
Well, I actually had a question later on about Magic Find in PoE2. Now, if I had to ask this question a month ago, I would basically say, the rarity quantity system works out pretty well. But I don't know if you've played much this league, but the wisps that you can generate, and you can generate a lot of them, have their own effective quantity and rarity multipliers. And it's maybe one of the first times we've seen such large rarity multipliers with such large quantity multipliers, and it does actually seem a little problematic with the amount of loot. I agree. So what kind of systems may we expect with Magic Find in PoE2?
Yeah, so what I think that we need to do is that the way that rarity works in PoE1, one of the issues with it is it saturates quickly. And also currency is not part of it. And also there's no kind of understanding of there's various other factors of value. So I don't want to go too much into the exact details of this, but effectively what we have to make sure of is that we have the ability to scale value of things on the ground with a single number, and for that to work for all types of items that monsters can drop in a good way, so that you actually feel like you're getting more. We don't just sort of saturate into uniques. I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but effectively you can get rarity to the point where no white items drop and only blue items drop, and then you can go from there so that only rares drop, and then you can go from there so that only uniques drop. That's possible, and with the way that PoE1's rarity system works. But we need to sort of change this so that it works better, so that you can actually get higher values of rarity without kind of making it so that you kind of get the saturation. And the reason why kind of more quantity is necessary in PoE1 is because more rarity. If we changed all sources of quantity to be rarity in PoE1, everything would just be unique, and you wouldn't get any more currency, and it kind of wouldn't be like that's not value in the right way, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So effectively, we need to improve the way the item drops work in order to make it so that, yeah, as I said, the goal would be you get like a ridiculous amount of juice. You see twice as many items on the ground, but you feel like you're getting, each item is on average 50 times more valuable than if you didn't do that. And then since you're 10 times faster at playing the game than other people, the end result of that is 1,000 times more wealth acquisition, if you know what I mean. So that's kind of my view on sort of how this should work, and we basically just have to get to the point where that can be the case. Yeah, we have a lot of changes in mind already. I don't necessarily want to talk about the exact specifics of all of them, but that's my thinking, at least around how it should be on a high level, if you know what I mean.
I saw a number of people asking in chat when you were talking. I think a lot of people are wondering if the find more stuff part of the game is going to be a stat on your gear. I think that's something people are quite curious about.
Whether or not there's magic find. Yeah, I mean, we definitely want to have magic find still in the game as a thing you can get.
Okay. And you're basically sacrificing character power for it, like you do in PoE1.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. That should work basically the same way.
Okay. So I was going to ask about the crafting bench being removed, but you mentioned recently to a Reddit reply that it's no longer going to be removed. And I kind of maybe wanted to ask more of a broad question. One part about Path of Exile 1 I really like is knowing that I can kind of guarantee some kind of big parts to making a character when like a new league starts. And in one end, it can be something like knowing that I can have access to a trigger craft on like a wand for a character like that. And in other cases, it can be like, while I might not be able to find a tier 0 unique, but for example, divination cards kind of offer this fragmented consistency of slowly knowing that you'll eventually get this one item. So is there going to be an element of that in PoE2? And maybe you can, I know some of the details are still getting worked out, but maybe some of your goals for the crafting bench, if you have set your mind.
So the crafting bench absolutely needs to exist for exactly this reason. You should be able to at least get some certainty, if you know what you're doing, of being able to fix issues with your build. You know, even if you don't find, you don't get lucky, you still are able to do something about that. So I think that's really important. So I think the crafting bench is good for that, and we do have a plan for what we're going to be doing to sort of make that work. As for divination cards, it's sort of interesting because divination cards, I really like them in theory. I really do. And in SSF, I think they work really well. But the problem with target farming is that you effectively, when you have an economy, effectively what you're always going to target farm is whatever has the most value in the economy, even if that's not the thing you actually want for yourself. You're just going to be like, okay, here's the thing that's going to have the most trade value, like per hour played on average. So therefore, I just play that. So I think that the way that that works in PoE1 with div cards is not so great. It sort of means that the people who, at least the people who want to get the most economic value, just end up farming one map forever and ever and ever.
Crimson Prison Gang is what they're called, apparently.
Yeah. So that's a problem. So I don't have an immediate solution to that. There's been various solutions proposed, basically changing the way that div cards work. I think, as I said, in SSF, it's cool. I like it. We need to do something different, I think, here. There'll be some discussion about that. But I do think div cards are cool. I'd like to see them come back in PoE2. We'll find a way, I suspect, to make that happen. But I don't know that they're necessarily going to work exactly the same mechanically as they do now.
Okay. I've been scouring the internet for all the PoE2 news, and that's included all your recent PoE2 interviews. And there was an interview you did at PAX West where you were asked what league mechanics are going to be ported over, at least roughly, from PoE1 into PoE2. And your answer was it kind of almost depends on which league mechanics you like. And it killed me that there was no follow-up question. So what PoE1 league mechanics do you like?
Okay, well, I am a big fan of Delve.
Okay.
And Incursion. Those are two of my favorites, partly because I just enjoyed development of them. Like, they were just really cool and thematic. I really enjoyed them. But I mean, there's lots of other mechanics that are just hugely, that are very popular with players. There's like Ultimatum and things like that. Like, these are great. I mean, I love Ultimatum too, but like there are certain crowd favorites for sure. Incursion. Sorry, I already said that one. Let me think about other ones. What are my favorites in there?
They don't have to be in PoE2. This is a non-commitment answer here.
I'm just trying to think of like, what are my other favorite ones? I mean, Breach, obviously. Breach was one of the earliest leagues that I really felt there was just something really, like, I feel like, because what was before Breach? There wasn't really that many good ones before
Legion,
right?
I think, was before Breach.
Was Legion before Breach?
Yes.
Surely not. Surely not. Am I wrong about that? Jeez. Maybe I'm just wrong about that.
But apparently I'm wrong about that. Okay.
Okay. right.
Legion was after. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, Breach, I'm a big fan of. There's a few things like Delirium is pretty cool. There's definitely some cool things like that. Generally speaking, though, a lot of the leagues that are my favorite ones are the ones which involve, and I know this is kind of can be a bit in the community. People have different opinions about this. But I do particularly like the ones that involve being some kind of map that has interesting mechanics on it, and you go out and you do stuff on it, which is why I particularly like things like Delve. But I know in the community, a lot of people prefer leagues that are inside, an area. So we tend to try to have a mix. I like when it comes to designing leagues, my favorite way to do it is kind of look at other games and be like, okay, what are some interesting, like, other games from completely different genres, and be like, how can we do some of the interesting gameplay from one of these and make it into a PoE league? So that's kind of tends to be what I most enjoy. And so I was kind of one of the people who really enjoyed things like Harvest, even though it was way too complicated and there were all sorts of problems with it. And I don't like the way Harvest is now. But the old way Harvest was, like, things like that were really cool. There were issues for sure.
Well, other than the gameplay side of things, one thing that I think is really important personally for a league mechanic is that it offers something you can't get anywhere else. Like, if you want to double corrupt an item, then you do template. You just have to. You can't get.
For sure.
Yeah. So is that going to be at least a thought process behind league design in PoE2?
100%. It's very important that that is what the end game makes the end game feel like there's a lot of variety, because you've got different goals. Like, oh, now I have to do this. Now I have to do this. Like, it adds a lot of variety to things. So it's really important that different content has different rewards that are possible from it, for sure.
I have a few questions about specific skills. Now, there's been a lot of new skills highlighted, a lot of combination of skills, a lot of skill modification with a few of the supports you've highlighted. But there are a few skills in PoE1 that I feel have kind of become the game for some players. So I wanted to kind of point those out, and if you can, maybe mention if there will be a skill like it in PoE2. So first up on the list, as probably many people might expect me to ask you, is Righteous Fire. Will we have a Righteous Fire in PoE2?
There will be Righteous Fire.
Will it work
exactly identically? No, but ideally it should feel like the same type of thing, and the flavor of Righteous Fire should all come across completely. But ideally we can do it in a way where it feels like there's interesting combos with it, has interesting mechanics that can work alongside it, and so on. So absolutely there will be Righteous Fire. And ideally, there should be any kind of really iconic thing from PoE1, like any kind of iconic skill. We will really need to find a place for it in PoE2 as well. We did have a discussion about the exact mechanics of how Righteous Fire works. We did come up with a plan, so hopefully you guys will enjoy it when we talk about it. I believe it should be in the Templar announcement at some point.
Okay. Well, closer to home for me is about minions. Now, you have mentioned that minions exist in PoE2, so we know that already. But I was personally curious if there is more of a push towards temporary minions, as there kind of is now in PoE1. Like the scaling from passive minions has kind of fallen off over the years in recent patches, and the scaling for temporary minions has actually increased over that same time span.
I have a lot of ideas around minions, and we're going to be talking about that when we announce the witch stuff later. I guess next year, technically still. So there's going to be a big discussion about that, and we've got a lot of features there. We put a lot of thought into minions. It's obviously one of those things that action RPG people, like there are a certain class of people who play action RPGs who that's all they want to play. So we have to make sure that we've got a really, really good minion story, as it were. Because of that. Minions are going to get a lot of attention, and you'll see that fairly soon, I think.
Now, one thing with minions that kind of comes as a drawback in PoE1 is kind of the visual clarity, where once I have more of a powerful summoner and I'm summoning more minions and they have like more AoE in their attacks, I feel like the visual clarity of just me being able to see the boss mechanics kind of starts going down and down. In PoE1, they has this like setting which is like bloom, but that affects both things. It affects both the boss mechanics in some cases, as well as like your skills and the minion skills. So there's no like great way to kind of maintain full clarity of the boss mechanics. But I am stronger, so I don't know. It's kind of been a trade-off in PoE1. Is there some address to this in PoE2?
There isn't like a specific technical, like here's the specific solution, but I can tell you that visual clarity of minions is like the primary concern that I have around minions, for sure, when looking at this stuff, because that is how there is a certain feeling you want with minions where you kind of like in PoE1 it just feels like chaos a lot of the time. Like there's just shit everywhere. Like it doesn't feel like there's a front line, as it were, and things like there's these kinds of issues. I want to try and make it feel a bit different in PoE2. So we do have a lot of like stuff around this, and even if you looked at the whiteboard in my office right now, like half the issues on there are visual clarity to do with minion issues right now. It's definitely a concern. It's just a matter of like just better design, really, when it comes to what the minions' abilities look like and this kind of stuff. As well as just there's just a lot of it's kind of like 1,000 individual subtle things that kind of add together to make things to have more clarity. And that's kind of true across PoE2 in general. Like there's a lot of focus on trying to make sure that there's visual clarity with the skills, even though they look really modern and cool, that there's still clarity. Like because we're get the opportunity to have a bit of a reset here graphically, it means that we can consider very carefully like what slots around the enemies do the different effects go in, and like how can we make sure that like we're kind of making sure, okay, like if something's like on like a, and this may actually not be like 100% correct, but it's like if something's on the like blade of the weapon, then that is always a herald effect, for example. Like nothing else is taking that slot on the character, so you kind of know that like like these kind of things are kind of what we're trying to do to make sure that everything has its place, and you kind of always can see things without having to have too much overlap. Hopefully, I mean, sure, a little bit of that goes out the door a little bit when you start having MTXs heavily involved, but at least without those, like the visual clarity should be very good if we're doing our job well.
Okay. So bit of a subject swap here. In PoE1, when it comes to designing a character, a lot of it kind of has to do with putting check marks on defensive goals. So the first round of goals is like avoiding lockouts, so you don't get stunned, don't get frozen. And then the second one is usually don't get killed by physical damage, because physical damage is unique in a way where more of it just ruins your ability to stack armor. And the third one is just like, does this character get one shot from typical stuff that happens to it? Is this kind of going to be a similar checklist in PoE2, or is it a different approach to defenses?
I don't know that it's not particularly easy to necessarily avoid that, but what I would say is that I would hope that we don't get to the point where you have to feel like every character needs to be completely immune to certain mechanics. Like ideally, it should be a reasonable choice to choose between, is this something I'm mitigating or is this something I'm completely preventing? So that should always feel like it's a choice. But at the same time, like having certain things you need to be able to deal with as part of a build is, like part of the, I guess, the trade-off you're making when it comes to like, how like you need a bit of tension to make defense, like to make it so that you don't just make a complete glass cannon with zero attention paid to defense at all. You do need to some extent to have, like how am I going to deal with this particular problem? So I think that will still be a thing. But I can't promise that the exact details around it will be the same in PoE2. This is honestly something that I am not myself as involved with, I would say, as some other people on the team. I mean, obviously, I still kind of like, talk about the stuff, but, people like Rory and Mark tend to be a little bit more, like knowing about, like have specific thoughts around that stuff.
Well, maybe this isn't too apt of a question, but I'll ask it anyway. Will you perhaps eventually be able to trivialize a mechanic entirely? Like, I know the stun mechanic in PoE2 is much more sophisticated than PoE1, but are you able to make a character that's completely ignoring stuns of all kinds if you want?
There should always be a way to do that. The cost of it should always be something, right? You know what I mean? So, like, I mean, there's absolutely will be a unique that's going to be like, you can't get stunned, right? There's going to be uniques like that.
Okay.
There may be a keystone that does like that does that in exchange for some kind of big downside, but there always just has to be a downside in order for that to be able to happen. And then, of course, you should be able to invest in stun reduction to the point where it no longer phases you as well, right? This kind of thing should be possible. So that should always be possible. It's just always like cost benefit, right? Like, what are you, what are you trading for that?
In terms of character design, I think it's maybe, at least for me, one of the best thing that PoE1 does, where it always seems difficult to get enough of everything. Like, you can make a character that does millions or even like 1 billion damage, but you can only really do that if you have no defenses. Or you can make a character that's extremely tanky, but the damage ends up being lackluster to a point where you literally have to tank more things.
For sure.
Is this going to be a similar approach to PoE2 character design?
Absolutely. And this has actually come up when we were discussing the tree about like things like, okay, so this is another tree philosophy thing, is like, okay, should it be that the reason that you get a variety of things on the tree is because there just aren't enough nodes for a given thing to be able to do that? Or should it be that there's always enough nodes to be able to allocate for a given thing? It's just that you don't want to do that because you've got other concerns that you need to do. And I think it's the second one that's important. Like, if you really want to allocate every single point into, some particular stat that's, freeze reduction or something random like that, then there will be nodes for you to do that. It's just that you don't want to do that because, that's not the only important thing. And I think that's kind of just generally how we look at our philosophy around this stuff.
All right. So some people aren't quite aware because, it's one class here, one class there, and we haven't seen a lot of like the trailers for the classes that already exist in PoE1, which we have at least heard of a little bit, that they're being redesigned in some ways. But eventually we're going to have 36 Ascendancy classes in PoE2. And my first question is, if we have like twice as many Ascendancy classes, is there going to be a different design in like the lifetime of a character when a new league comes out or a new content update comes out? Like, are you expecting players to play like many characters in each season, or like one or two, kind of how they are in PoE1?
I think it would just be like how it is in PoE1, honestly. The fact that there's a lot of options there, I mean, the intention is for PoE2 to last a long time, right? So like ideally, like having more classes like that just means that it's going to be a lot longer before you have run out of stuff to try. So ultimately, that's the reason why there's so many, that we just want to have a lot of stuff that you can to play around with. So I imagine that in each league it's going to be 1 to 2 characters, just like it is in PoE1.
Mm-hmm. In PoE1, it's taking like dedicated players that are focusing on leveling. I'm not going to say some days, which are like the fastest times, but let's say like a week to hit max level. Is that kind of like a goalpost that you guys are trying to hit in PoE2 as well, in terms of the pacing for a character?
I think it should take a bit longer than a week. I would sort of feel like I'd want to go back a little bit in terms of how long it takes to be more like what it was like sort of 3 to 4 years ago, I would say. Where it was a bit longer. But I mean, it'll take people a while just to sort of learn the game, I think. So I suspect the first time people play the content, it's going to take them quite a while. Like, as I was saying before, like, the first time I beat a boss earlier, it was like 5 minutes, and then like that went down on my second time to like 2 minutes. So even just from that perspective, like and it slowly improves. So I think that people will get faster and faster. So I mean, I honestly don't know at this point how long it will take people the first time through the campaign, and I suspect it will take them a very long time. But yeah, it'll get faster.
What is a very long time?
Um, I honestly don't know for sure because we don't have like the entire like not every area is like fully like it's not playable. I mean, all the areas are there, but they're not playable in the sense that like if you have bad monsters, like when I say bad, I mean like monsters that don't have like all their abilities and stuff like that in an area, it's just boring. So like nobody wants to play those areas. So that means that we don't really have like proper progression testing. Like we've polished the first half of each act kind of thing. And so we haven't got like a sort of full, like you can just play through the whole game to do progression testing yet. So that means that I can't actually say how long it will take, but I honestly believe that like for an average player, I mean like it's got to be at least 40, 50 hours, I think.
Oh, wow.
I imagine that's how long it will take sort of your average player to get through. Like it could be longer, honestly, for people who like haven't played an action RPG before, probably. So that kind of things. I mean, I guess that's kind of like half an hour per zone when you include like fighting bosses. Like I sort of want people to die like 1 to 2 times on each boss the first time they play it, because they haven't learned the mechanics yet. Like it should feel that way when you're kind of playing through the first time. So that will mean like that kind of thing. So like it's just a little bit harder, like but the thing is, I think PoE1 may even be that hard for people who just play the game for the first time now. It's just that once you played it, however many times people have played it, it becomes trivial to the point where you're like, okay, I could never die to this thing. But because of the fact that you actually that you have to restart the boss if you die to it now, it will force you to actually learn the mechanics and kind of work out these things during your first playthrough.
Okay.
So that'll be interesting. But yeah, it'll take people a while.
All right. Well, that is it for the questions that I had personally, but I have scoured the internet for unanswered questions, and I have picked a few up from chat. And if you guys want to post your question in chat, if it's at least different enough from what we've already discussed or what I have, I'll maybe try to include it near the end. But yeah, we people do have to be in places eventually, so we don't have Jonathan forever. But yes, with that in mind, I want to ask some of the questions. They might be a little bit less researched than some of my own, so might brace yourself for some short answers, but that's okay, hopefully. So here we go. I found this one on a YouTube comment, I believe. I think it was on the official thread of this interview on the PoE forums. So tell us about the die system you mentioned in 2019. I don't know anything about this, so please.
Yeah, I guess I probably mentioned that back in ExileCon back in 2019. It's something that we could still do, but it's not honestly something that I've kind of thought about for a little while. I know it's something that a lot of players are very keen for, but like it's kind of not really on my radar at this point. Like we're just focusing on content really. But there's nothing really preventing us from doing it. It would just be a matter of marking up all the armors and the parts that get modified and so on. So it's just a bunch of work there. But yeah, it can be done. I don't know if really it would be there at release. It's kind of, I know that would be disappointing for a lot of players, but it's just kind of one of those things that has kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit as we've been grinding out on a bunch more content, unfortunately.
All right. So 99% of PoE2 misgivings have been about the gameplay pace. Now, you've kind of adjusted this a little bit, but I kind of want to ask it again and ask you how is it current relative to maybe what we've seen a few months ago at ExileCon? Is that still kind of what we're expecting? Or is that, as you mentioned, a bit slowed down so people can kind of see the clarity a little bit?
So I guess I kind of don't really like. Okay, so a lot of people are like, oh, you're slowing it down to do this, or you're kind of like they have a lot of things like that. But I think really when it comes to when we're like so. This actually relates to a little bit what I was saying before about how we haven't been able to do full progression testing yet. Which is that what that means is that when we're balancing an area to do a demonstration or for ExileCon, the demos and all that sort of stuff, we kind of just we make a character that's about what we think it should be for this area, and then we kind of balance the monsters from that point for the demo to just kind of hit like what we want, where we expect to sort of be able to understand the mechanics and kind of like give a good showing to how the class should be. I think at ExileCon, it probably was balanced a little hard. But the thing is, each demo is kind of its own thing because of the fact that, yeah, like as I said, we don't have a full like sort of progression test through the whole game yet. So ExileCon, because of these demos are just like how they are. Effectively, what it is just like me and Mark will play it, and then we'll be like, did we get through it too quickly or didn't we? And then adjust accordingly. So we just adjust it until it feels fun to us. So I think when people maybe sort of ascribe a little bit too much to that sometimes. That being said, I think that it's probably best to look at the pacing stuff to be more like when we were discussing earlier with maps and what the median player versus the 1% players would be doing. I think we still want to make sure that there's still a 10 times disparity in efficiency between a good and a bad player in that situation. And so that would certainly imply that there can be certainly a pretty good amount of pace you can get up to. But what I do think is also bad, and I guess this is another philosophical thing, is that I don't think it's really good when you someone opens up Path of Exile on Twitch, they look at what the game looks like at the absolute 1% end of it, and it just looks like utter, just like what is even going on the screen. You know, it's just like shit is everywhere. There's like there's no visual clarity. I cannot tell what the hell is going on, and the boss melts in like 2 seconds. You know what I mean? Like I don't think that's really very good either. So you do need to be able to get a lot more efficiency than the average player, but we do have to be a little bit careful. But I don't know, like I guess all of that is to say that like it's a little bit hard to say exactly what the pace will be like in maps at this point. I have no doubt that the peak will still be high, but it may not be as high as it currently is in PoE1. I think that's very likely. But at the same time, like it's really important that people feel like they're able to break the game. Like you want people to feel like, oh, I'm breaking the game right now. I'm like got an insane amount of projectiles, like way more than I should be able to have, like all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess this is a bit of a hedged non-answer, which I worry is a bit of a problem here.
Well, it's still in development. I can't fault you for that.
Right.
The way that I asked the question was, kind of seeing post-Ruthless experiment what your thoughts may be on the matter.
And you're definitely right that it's the number one issue that people talk about PoE2. Like the fear in the PoE1 community is that it's just going to be super slow paced. And I don't think it will feel that way. I think that when you play it, you will have fun. And ultimately, that's all that I'm after, right? So it's actually interesting because there's been cases of this, right? Where like I was playing the Mercenary in the demo for the demo that we recorded, and then I went back and I played. What was it I was playing? I think it might have been the Warrior actually. Afterwards, the demo character we had at ExileCon, I was like, man, this is way too slow. So even just from me, like it can often be the case that my opinions change as I'm playing as I'm playing things. This is really going to come down to the progression testing to kind of see how we feel. But I guess the guiding star, I suppose, at the end of the day, has to be that when you get an item, you feel like it improved your character. Because if you don't have that, then you have nothing. We still have to maintain that feeling through the whole game, and there has to be a feeling of progress as you go through. So that's we'll kind of I guess end up where we end up, where it honestly, and it may sound a bit silly, but it's like it just has to feel fun to me, right? Like I have to play it and feel like this feels fun.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't feel fun to me, then I'll increase the numbers, and that's really what it comes down to.
I have a question about how much of an endgame map is the boss in it, I suppose. You've kind of answered this slightly through your mastery of, repeatedly going up against these bosses and just defeating them faster and faster. But I guess we can broadly ask you perhaps, how much of a map that you do in the endgame of PoE2 should the boss be?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of drops, at the very least, so we've actually discussed the drops in particular. I think that 1/3 of the map should be boss drops. 1/3 of the map should just be regular monsters, and 1/3 of the map should be other events and things that come up, like League content and things like that. Which isn't to say necessarily that every map will always have stuff like that, but on average across many maps, it should be about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Ideally, that should roughly map onto the amount of time that you spend doing those things as well. So that's kind of my view on it, at least. Is roughly 1/3, I would say, should be the map boss.
I don't know if you're fully comfortable answering this one, but inquiring minds are curious. Why did you guys decide to continue working on 1 and 2 at the same time, like separately, rather than evolving PoE1 to PoE2? I know it was like a big announcement that it's going to be its own project, but I guess people really didn't get the why sufficiently.
So it really comes down to, we want to be able to make whatever changes we want to make without it becoming a problem for the existing community. And when we first announced in 2019 what we were planning on doing, I don't think we appreciated at the time the degree to which the changes would actually change the game. And so it really just came down to, like, we had people in the office who were like, I'm really worried that the game, like, I'm talking about people in the QA team and things like that. They were just really worried. I'm worried that the game that you make won't necessarily be the Path of Exile that I like, right? I mean, they still look at what we're doing and, they like what we're doing. But there was some worry there. Mm-hmm. And so when I heard that, I kind of thought about it like pretty hard for a while. I talked to Mark quite a bit about it, and we kind of said, we really just wanted to be free to be able to let the games diverge without having to constantly work. Because I worried that the decisions that we wanted to make for PoE, like, I didn't want PoE1 to hold PoE2 back as far as like having to make balanced decisions. Like, we didn't want to have things like where we're like, oh, we can't change this because then all these players will get angry, or things like that. We wanted to be kind of free to be able to just like make whatever changes we wanted to make. And I think the PoE1 compatibility idea was just sort of starting to become a thing where, like, oh, we can't change this because it would, break this or break that or whatever it was. So that's really the reason. And once we decided that, I think we started to get a lot more crazy with the kind of changes that we were doing. So things like WASD, I don't think would have happened under the old model. I don't think we would have been able to accept that kind of thing, just because the mode we were thinking about was much too much a kind of like, we're extending the game rather than making a new game. I think it was not enough in that direction. So it really just comes down to that. And as for why we want to continue supporting PoE1, well, I mean, like, it's still a great game. It just it's just a bit of a different game. So I think it's absolutely very valuable to support, and a lot of people will still enjoy it. Like, I see no reason why we can't do both.
All right, that's excellent. I had a question. People were wondering about hideouts. The question they had was, are you going to have bigger or more in-depth hideouts than PoE1? But I guess the base question is, are we even going to have hideouts at all?
There'll be hideouts. There'll be hideouts for sure. Mechanically, I don't think they'll probably change too much. Maybe there's probably more we can do to make them a bit more interesting. But I still really like the whole freeform placement and decorating and all that sort of stuff. I want to keep all of that. It should work the same way. And also the PoE1 microtransaction hideouts, I want to still be there. In PoE2, you can still use them and just have that as your hideout. That should all come across.
A question was about losing experience on death. I think it's pretty interesting because right now in PoE1, some people like it, some people don't like it, but the landscape for it is like, if you run up against the boss where you die, you just look up how to beat the boss, or you look up a build that can beat the boss. But with none of that existing in PoE2, I feel like the death penalty, if it was the same, would feel a bit overbearing in some cases.
Yeah. So in campaign, there's no XP penalty in PoE2.
Okay.
It's gone. And that's because you're expected to die to the bosses. And basically, as soon as like the declaration of, I want you to be dying one to two times for each campaign boss for the first time, kind of implies, well, we can't have an XP penalty then. And also in PoE1, that was the only penalty that actually was anything, because of the fact that you could just go resume the boss from where you left off. Whereas now the penalty is that you have to start the boss again. That's enough of a penalty in itself. So that's fine. We don't need the X penalty anymore. But the one question is, what about in maps? And I don't necessarily think that the X penalty is that important in early end game. But I think in late end game, it actually is very important. And that's because you need, in order to have some kind of challenge to make it challenging to get to level 100, you need to have something that's kind of going to make it like effectively a build check, as it were, to make sure that you actually have survivability in your build. And so the X penalty is what makes that allowed to happen. So we definitely need to have an X penalty towards the very end of the game. So I'm not exactly sure what we're going to be doing to sort of kick that in exactly yet. But there'll be some kind of kick in of X penalty towards the later end game to sort of make it so that you still have to actually have a survivable build to get to level 100.
The next question I have, I'll just read it as it was asked, but I do know there's a bit more to it, so I'll add on it a little bit. So the question was, how do we interact with flasks, and how many flask slots do we have? I know it's been announced that the flasks kind of will not recover from normal monsters and will be kind of in a way replacing guard skills. So do you have maybe a bit more to add about that?
So basically, the philosophy there. So just to talk a little bit about why we did that. So to have it so that so only blues and above monsters will actually recover life flasks, because there wasn't enough state in Path of Exile 1, in my opinion, with regard to your character. And what I mean by that is, and this actually, which one was it? I'm talking about Final Fantasy 13, I think it was. Was that the one? I think it was Final Fantasy 13, which is a game I hated. The reason I didn't like it was because your character, you effectively every time, every time you finished a battle in that game, your character was reset to full life. What that meant was is that there were really no resources. Like there was no feeling of like if you fight a group of 5 monsters and you fight the same group of 5 monsters again, it's literally always exactly the same fight, because there's no resource that carries on between the fights. And that was a thing that made me really dislike that game, because it just felt very grindy, because there was no sort of feeling of tension of like getting like in previous games in that series, there was this feeling of like you leave town, you kind of have this like your health is kind of slowly decreasing as you sort of go through the game, and then eventually you run out of resources and you have to go back. And while I don't necessarily want it to be that you're always going to run out of flask charges in PoE2, that is not the case. I do want it to be that it isn't just that you're always on full flask charges, because the flasks have to kind of on some level the flasks are really your health bar. You can recover your life in PoE very, very quickly. And so it's really your flask state that is kind of the main state of your character. And so like that is something that I kind of want to make still be the case. Now there's going to be things like leech and so on that's going to allow you to solve those problems that not like without necessarily using flasks. And then of course towards the end game you're going to be replacing some of your flasks with other things and so on. But I do think that it is important that you don't just feel like every time I kill a pack I get all of my life flasks, my flask charges back. As for guard flasks and things like that, flasks are a nice like resource limiting mechanic that we can use to allow for things where we don't want to have a cooldown, but we do want to have something that you use on occasion. And I think the tension between life, mana, and what other resource that you have is pretty good. But at the same time, we don't want to kind of be flask piano where you're just like constantly, just constantly using them. So ideally, they kind of get to a point where you use them in the right circumstance, you don't use them otherwise, and there's some interesting tension there. And they can serve as a nice resource mechanic that all players have access to, that you can kind of choose, like what you want to use there. So hopefully that kind of gives you some idea, unless you've got any other questions about any of that sort of like kind of basic philosophy around flasks.
Personally, no. I'm kind of curious to see what you guys come up with in the final design of it. I think it's one of those things where there's so many factors that come together to like a feel-good flask system. That's really difficult for me to say I like it because of A, right? It's just the whole thing has to kind of have a good feel to it.
Right. But I will say that not having charges come from normal monsters was an instant game feel upgrade, in my opinion, when we made that change. And surprisingly, we didn't I thought we would have to buff the amount of flask charges that monsters gave, the ones that do give charges in response to that, and then we just didn't, and it seemed to be fine. So that might not be entirely accurate, but yeah, it didn't take much to actually make that change work well, as it turned out.
Okay.
The biggest issue actually was just really early game before you have very many blue and yellow monsters. Because you weren't getting enough charges there. So that's when we made it so that checkpoints give you charges, and that kind of resolved the issue, plus a bit of tweaking about early game flask, like the pool size and a few other details like that, and we kind of managed to get it to feel pretty good, I think.
All right. So a question here is about like casual group play. It said that other ARPGs in the genre generally do it pretty well, but in PoE it felt punishing to play with another person. Is the question that I
Um,
found online. So I'm kind of
okay.
curious if PoE2 will kind of address kind of like casual play with other people in ways that PoE1 doesn't, perhaps.
Well, there is a few things we have going on there, but I don't really want to announce any of that right now, unfortunately. But I'm curious to know what the punishing thing is actually referring to with that. Because I don't know that I feel like I
I
am
I've
aware
been
about that
SSF
issue.
for like 4 years personally, so yes, I don't have much input
Yeah.
on this either.
Maybe I'm just terribly misinformed about this, but I guess I'm not aware of the being punishing to play with another person particularly. I mean, sure, the life increases, but you've got more people. I don't know that. I guess I don't. I guess I don't know what that's referring to. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Um, I have a question about a character preview with MTX being
hmm
ported over and its
hmm
own MTX.
hmm
Path of Exile 1, you just kind of have to impractically zoom
Yeah,
on your
yeah,
character
yeah.
to
I'm
fully
aware.
appreciate it.
This is something that we intend to address, and you should note that because the MTX store is the same in PoE 1 and 2, that any changes we do make to the MTX store will be in PoE 1 as well, because they'll have the same shop. So, yeah, it's something that I definitely hear. We would like to have MTX preview. We are working on it, and we will hopefully get there before too long. Because yes, I agree, it's something that we really should have. But I will note that while it's easy for certain things, it is quite hard for others, especially with the complexity around the MTXs these days. So yeah, there's quite a lot of work to do there, but we are intending to do that work. So I'm hoping we'll be able to get that one before too long.
All right. Now, this question doesn't have quite that much meaning to me, but when I opened up
Mhm.
the floor to Twitch chat to ask their questions, the one that was spammed like crazy was cross save slash cross platform play question mark. So
Yep.
maybe you can do them a favor and give them some insight.
I really do want to talk about this, but our console stuff, we kind of haven't really talked about this yet. But suffice to say, PoE2 will be a much better experience on console than PoE1 was, and take that answer for what you will. But we're going to be talking a lot more about those details before too long when we talk about what we've got going on console.
With console play being part of the mindfulness of the project, let's say, what what might people expect for hardware requirements? Are the ones listed on the Steam page still about right?
I believe that the Steam Path of Exile 2, the Path of Exile 2 Steam page, which you can go to and wishlist, by the way, just to quickly plug that, I should be correct. So I believe that's what's listed on there is like a 960 as the lowest. That's NVIDIA 960 is the lowest spec. And that probably won't be like the most amazing experience ever on that card, but I believe that's what we have as our sort of minimum requirement there.
All right.
Mhm.
What is your stance on builds that require 10 plus uniques to function? And for the example they gave us the Golemaster, so I guess we're including jewels in this list of 10.
I mean, there should absolutely be builds like that, but ideally, most builds have some combination of rares and uniques. Would be my opinion. But I mean, yeah, like that kind of thing can happen, right? You want some builds to be expensive and some to be cheap. That's just absolutely a factor. So yeah, there should be some expensive builds out there.
Um, Question: how can we get a beta key for PoE2?
So we haven't officially announced that yet, but if you look at the 300 beta, you should expect something very similar to what happened there.
Okay. About the rearrangement of UI pieces, will there be an option to drag buffs and debuffs around, I guess, for personal customization clarity type of thing?
Um, I know our UX guy was kind of keen on this, which is possibly what we might potentially allow that. There's sort of various updates to how that stuff works. I guess I'm sort of mostly fine with that. It's probably not that hard to implement, so it's something we could probably do. But I don't want to promise it immediately, just because I'd have to kind of like do a bit more exploration of it. But our UX guy was kind of keen for something like that.
Okay. Um, So I have a pretty long question here. I'm just trying to understand it to summarize it a bit. But I guess the question is, how much will you be able to kind of customize an encounter, like, for example, a map, to kind of be something your character can take on? Like, let's say if it's a map with a difficult boss where he'd scale like lightning damage, you wouldn't want to do like a minus max resists in PoE1, for example. You have that layer of customizability to curb the
Right.
challenge.
So
Is something like that going to exist in PoE2?
there will definitely be ways to customize. Like, I mean, like in PoE1, there will definitely be things you can do to customize maps. As a starting point, of course, there's just map mods, right? Like just the mods that are on the map, and that's still there and still works largely the same way. Although there will be a lot of the particulars will change a lot as far as like the exact mods and everything like that, and the way that the rewards of it scale and this kind of thing. There will also need to be a system that won't be the Atlas tree, like it won't be the same as the Atlas tree, but certainly there needs to be other sources of mods that maps can get in some fashion, and that will come down to the design of the in-game system, which we haven't talked about yet. But effectively, there will need to be things like that. So hopefully that kind of answers the question about that. But effectively, there'll be the same sort of things you can expect from PoE1 and in-game, where you can customize maps basically
Okay, good.
with mods and stuff.
So a question here about the flask system once again. Is there a chance that refilling flasks at wells will be revisited if players don't like it? And maybe I can actually add a little bit of input on this. So in Ruthless, this is how it works. And what I did in my hideout is I put the NPC that refills flasks right next to the portal I normally take when I enter the map. So it's literally like one extra click for me, to the point where, yeah, it doesn't really seem super worth it to have that as a mechanic because you trivialize it anyway. What do you think?
Um, so this is one of those funny little things where, like, it may not seem to matter that much. There's just a tiny little extra bit of making the town cycle feel like it has some purpose. You know what I mean? I do appreciate the fact that in Ruthless, like, sure, I mean, the fact that you can move stuff around in your hideout kind of just means that it ends up in in-game being mostly trivialized. And maybe what that actually means is that for hideouts, we make it so that it works a little bit different, and like it just refills it just refills your flasks automatically while there, or something like that. But it was just kind of like, just during the campaign though, it just kind of has the slight feeling of like, like makes the world feel a little bit more kind of, like, I guess it just, you want a bit of physicality to some of these things in some cases. I don't think that once you've kind of done it a little bit in PoE2, it doesn't feel particularly wrong at all. We've made sure to place the wells pretty close to where the portals are and this kind of thing. But I mean, look, at the end of the day, we're not in the business of, like, making people hate us for no reason, right? Like, if everyone's really, really, really hating it constantly, then I guess we would change it. But at the same time, I hope people are just fine with it, and it won't be a particular issue when you actually play with it in practice.
All right, excellent. Well, that is my list of questions, and I did kind of go through chat. I know some people still had their own question, but in many cases, I feel like I've, in a way, interpreted in a different question. So I think this is a good point to kind of put an end to it. An hour and a half, I think, is a digestible format still for most people anticipating Path of Exile and Path of Exile 2. So perhaps we can end on a note. Thank you so much for joining us, and perhaps you can mention when we might expect the next big announcement for PoE2 updates or any tidbit of news coming up.
So I don't have any particular date, but I wouldn't think it would be too far into next year when we would be announcing some more stuff. We've got a huge amount of announcements to do next year. We probably need to get started fairly early.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Jonathan. I hope it's been a good experience for you, and I hope chat has enjoyed it as well. We'll get this up for you guys to watch on VOD format. And if you have any questions, I've seen outside of this interview, I've seen Jonathan personally reply to many people's questions on the PoE2 subreddit. So he's very active in the community. If you have any follow-up questions, just throw it out there. There's actually a pretty good chance Jonathan's eyes will hit it.
For sure.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. See you later.